Hey, this is Acorn Productions. We're talking about the issue of slavery and the Civil War and perhaps Reconstruction, depending on how long this conversation goes. Um, Coming into the war, Abraham Lincoln famously said that the war was about preserving slavery and it wasn't about the war was about preserving the Union and it wasn't about the institution of slavery. But events would force his hand, and ultimately the war would be just as much about slavery as it was caused by slavery itself. Um, as we as the war progressed, the generals in the field had to make decisions about what to do with slaves because the slaves perceived Union armies coming into territories as forces of liberation. Additionally, the people who had supported John Brown, Harper's Ferry Raid, people who had supported the abolitionist cause were like, this war is obviously about slavery, including the person who had founded the Republican Party that Lincoln was the first president of, Horace Greeley, who was a newspaper editor, and he very famously published an editorial calling out Abraham Lincoln for making this war a war about slavery. And Lincoln stayed with his position, even though he's already shifting in his heart. He stayed with this position at the time, and he wrote a letter to the editor in response, and said essentially, if I can end this war and while getting rid of slavery, I will do so. If I can end this war and slavery must be preserved, I will do so. It is my primary purpose to end this war. How did generals handle slaves when they started running the Union lines, seeming to be feeling that they were liberated, like touching freedom if they got to the Union Army? Well, generals didn't want to return slaves to their owners. That's giving property back to their enemy. They were trying to make military decisions and pragmatic decisions that were in their best interests, and ultimately the first solution was to call slaves contrabands, which is essentially calling them property of the army, not to be returned to the enemy. Now, this optically makes it look like the Union Army is owning slaves, while my take is that the slaves who had made it to Union lines saw this as a chance to get their meals paid for and help support the cause that was going to ultimately lead to their freedom, and they felt they were free. Either way, this policy had some moral ambiguity. Abolitionists are going, President Lincoln, do we now own slaves with the Army? On the opposite part, John C. Fremont, who was the military governor of Missouri, where there was a lot of guerrilla warfare going on, issued an emancipation proclamation that said, if there are any planters that are supporting and fomenting rebellion in the state, I'm freeing your slaves. And this was very, very popular among abolitionists. However, it was in contradiction of Lincoln's stated policy on slavery, and ultimately Lincoln had Fremont's emancipation undone while trying to figure out how to issue his own. And he was trying to issue an emancipation proclamation, but lacking any successful battles in the Eastern Theater, his advisors are saying you can't lose with guns and then try to achieve victory with the pen. And you need a victory before you issue this Emancipation Proclamation. And that victory happened in 1862, the first time, this is before the Battle of Gettysburg, the first time that Lee entered Northern Territory into Maryland in the Battle of Antietam. In the aftermath of the Union victory, which was a really bloody fight, mostly to a draw at Antietam, when Lee returned back to Virginia, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that said, for any area that is still in rebellion, in 90 days, you have 90 days to come back in rebellion come back into the Union if you want to keep your slaves. But if January 1st comes and you have not laid down your arms, we are declaring all of your slaves freed. And lo and behold, on January 1st, 1863, the historic Emancipation Proclamation was unveiled, and it immediately freed a grand total of 0 slaves, because it was for slaves still in the rebellion. However, this is a turning point. Great Britain, which had a very high anti-slavery population, was very proud of its early efforts in getting rid of the institution of slavery, virtually guaranteed they would never enter the war on the side of the Confederacy at this point. While there are many Northerners, like recent Irish immigrants who didn't want to be drafted into this fight about slavery to create their own economic competition at the bottom of the social ladder, and they erupted in riots in New York City over in part the issue of emancipation and the draft riots in 1863. While it wasn't an entirely sound of unison in support of this, now there was a cause that people, while they were fighting in the Union Army in uniform, the people who were fighting to end slavery were getting to do so. And soldiers that won battles could physically, I don't know if it's physical, but could actually see the liberation of slaves under the Emancipation Proclamation. And it just, to me, just always feels like that would be such a tremendous feeling to come out of a battle where you're not sure if you're going to live or not, and then you see liberty bestowed on human beings that had lived their entire lives as slaves. This boosted the morale of the Union Army, which morale had been on the advantage of the Confederacy defending their homeland versus the ideological pursuit to preserve the Union. Now it was the end of slavery. And another thing midway through the war when this is issued is that this paved the way for the entry of almost 200,000 African American soldiers in the Union effort during the Civil War, at a time when more people in uniform was critical for winning the war. So this was a key aspect of it. Now, African American soldiers in uniform initially treated with the inequality that almost all Americans had. Well, you can't have guns. We shouldn't have to pay you as much. You won't be effective in combat. And unfortunately, while this was resolved on the battlefield in the Civil War, it had to be resolved again on the battlefield of the Spanish-American War, and then again on the battlefield of World War I, and again in the battlefield of World War II, before equality or anything like it was beginning to be achieved for African Americans in the United States society. African Americans formed into a host of military units and served throughout the war, but most textbooks will focus on the unit, the 54th Massachusetts, which is commemorated with the statue in Boston, and a movie called Glory, in which I believe Denzel Washington won his first Academy Award. And it depicts the struggle for African American soldiers to win equal pay, to win the right to have arms, to win the right to be in combat duty, and ultimately to be given the honor to lead a failed assault on Fort Wagner at the head of an assault in 1863. And so African Americans served in the Union Army and kind of passed the ultimate test of citizenship. And in the eyes of some at the time, eroded the racial views, the very common beliefs that Africans were not equal to Europeans in caliber or humanity. However, I can't speak racism very well, but however the perceptions were at the time, held even by Abraham Lincoln, who was a fan of the Back to Africa movement at the time, the very first one that helped with the creation of freeing slaves and sending them to Africa, even if they had been in the Americas for 4 generations. The country of Liberia was formed with its capital of Monrovia in the 1820s, based on this movement's ideology of the American Colonization Society. That's back in time periods past. So as we get to the end of the war, the question is, what do we do with slavery? And really, without debate, even the 4 states that had joined the Union, expecting to be rewarded with preservation of slavery, I don't find strong anecdotal evidence of anger that the end of the war came with the movement to create the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The one seeming given that came out of the bloody Civil War is that slavery was over. What to do after it, how to adjust the lives of former slaves and make them residents of the United States of America, that was fraught with peril and concern from that time forward, and still has a legacy that impacts American society to this day. What freedmen wanted on receiving their freedom at the end of the Civil War and moving into the period called Reconstruction is they wanted to get their families together, and they wanted security, and they wanted some economic independence. While most former slaves' experiences were in agriculture, They did not want to return, as their former slave owners wanted them to the system of gang labor in which they would be paid wages with white overseers. They wanted an independence. Ideally, they wanted land ownership, which many people, including the Freedmen's Bureau, General Sherman, as he marched through, thought was the proper thing to do, was to seize former plantations of rebels who had defied the United States and distribute that land in 40-acre plots to the freedmen who had worked it. I think this is an unlikely result in many different ways because of the commitment to property rights that really is inherent in the Declaration of Independence. Uh, uh, the right to pursue equality and the pursuit of happiness, written in the Declaration of Independence, was really a, a paraphrase of Locke's same phrase, but was property. Um, So ultimately, the United States is going to honor the land title of Confederates, and this means that African Americans are going to be free but propertyless. The compromise is going to be called sharecropping. It is a compromise for social order in which the white Southerners who are also concerned about security and very afraid about what a freed labor force would do, wanted African Americans committed to yearly job contracts, and also wanted them working land. Ideally, they wanted the labor system to look very similar to the way it had under slavery. The less efficient system was breaking up the land in plots and renting it out to former slaves for them to work, and both would share in the profits of the proceeds. This was an inefficient form of labor, but it gave to of farming, but it gave to African Americans that independence. They had authority over the lands that they were working. They didn't have day-to-day oversight. Ultimately, this contributed to the poverty of the post-war South, and it contributed to the poverty of African Americans as they were in a cycle of debt, as the people who decided what share crop they got, what the interest was on the supplies and the seeds that they needed to get through the year until they were able to have a payday with the sharecropping system, would have to pay. And African Americans tended to fall in debt, even as many were able to work themselves out of the system of sharecropping and into property ownership. It was a much more common story that African Americans fell into debt and were in that way economically bound to the land in a system that was getting increasingly segregated. In the period of Reconstruction, African Americans were briefly awarded full political rights, including voting. And in that time period, which is called Republican rule, in which during Reconstruction, which we'll talk about, African Americans held office at every level, almost every level, all the way up to the United States Senate and a governor, in a way that those two offices wouldn't be held again by African Americans until the 1990s. I said 1990s. However, the end period was a return to democratic rule that they called redemption, and slowly the creation of laws to preserve a social order that they insisted upon, in which whites were at the top of society and blacks were subservient. This was done by coercion through groups like the KKK and intimidation through groups like the KKK and social custom. But beginning, and again, this is the end of Reconstruction, is 1877. We're beginning in the 1890s. Jim Crow laws were passed and upheld by the Supreme Court that eroded at African American rights and segregated African Americans and white Americans in almost all walks of life. And those laws would be in place, upheld by the 1896 Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, that said segregation was okay as long as it was separate but equal. Those laws would be in place until the 1950s and beyond, and legal discrimination would be the law of the land in many parts of the United States for years to come. And we haven't even gotten into to social and other forms of discrimination that were out there. Uh, all right, so that is the end of that topic, and I will be coming back with political reconstruction.